Okay, so thank you for the invitation, and I apologize with some of you who have already listened to me and listened to what I'm going to say about economic globalization. This is part of my book on the economics of globalization. The painting is by my wife. I'm telling to Giuseppe, and I'm honored that he's here. The painting is by my wife, by Carlotta. And well, a few words about the economics of globalization that I claim is different from international economics because it implies so many other things. It implies a little bit of international trade, international economics, yes, monetary economics, yes, but also development economics, also economic history, also some international political economy, international business. So it's different from international economics, just to clarify a little bit. And also this quotation, which comes from De Cecco, who had been writing this book for several years, and Marcello De Cecco, unfortunately, before passing away, he saw me at some point and he said with his famous voice, Della Post, hurry up with that book on globalization because, that's going to finish soon, and he was seeing this in advance. He was seeing this already when globalization was, not many people were suggesting that globalization was about to finish. So very quickly, different phases of globalization. Well, we economists, we tend to, we want to have measures. So this is why we consider globalization as starting from, the second part of 1870. So here we have different views. Historians claim, with the geographical discoveries already globalization started. So why not for economists? Because this is the first time in which we could measure the convergence of prices, right? So here, in this period, is the first time in which prices across the world could converge. And of course, this was also due to the fact that there were technical improvements, technical discoveries. So the Suez Canal, for example, 1869 is one possible date, if you want to have a date for the beginning of globalization, precisely because, trade across the world was made possible. And also steamships made possible to trade across the world. So in a way, it was not possible to have price convergence before. And so some of these issues, why are we considering globalization starting that period is addressed in the book. Different phases, these are all pictures taken from other people's work, and we see that there is a first phase that starts again in 1870 and is characterized by the increase in the three different sectors we are going to consider as representative of the economic life of economic activity. So goods market, goods and services, and then the factors labor and capital. And we see that in labor, in capital, in trade, globalization had been improving in the first period. Then we had the setback between the two world wars, and this was already a sign that it is not necessarily true that there is no alternative. The famous Margaret Thatcher acronym, globalization cannot be resisted. Well, already history proved that globalization can be reverted because that was a wonderful period, that one, and I have a quotation here by John Maynard Keynes that most of you, I guess, know. What an extraordinary episode in the economic progress of man that age was, which came to an end in August 1914. So already there, globalization had gone down. Already there, a period of trade, of prosperity had finished. So we see that over the different periods, trade has been increasing more than world GDP. We see that that has been favored by technical improvements, by transportation costs going down, by airplane costs going down, by communication, and so on. But also by choices, by the choices of the governments, by tariffs going down. So it is not irresistible globalization. It is not true that there is no alternative. Why? Because it also depends on the tariffs, as we are experiencing this day. It does not only depend on on the technical aspects. Over time, this is another very famous picture by Madison. And here we see let's focus on the white and the black. The white is China. And this is what China was at the beginning, well, at the beginning of this picture, 1820. So the GDP of China in the world was much larger than any other country in the world. Then over time, what happened was that North America increased, but then what's happening today is probably that China is going back to the role that used to occupy in the past. So the first period of globalization, but I want to rush, otherwise I will not have time, was characterized by the British Empire, with the British pound ruling in a system which was dominated by the gold standard. And again, this was a period in which the three aspects of globalization, trade, labor, and capital, were all of them increasing. 2 world wars and the first crisis of globalization. And here we see already something astonishingly similar to what is happening today. There was a crisis, and then after the crisis, protectionist policies, populism, nationalism started in that period. So is there any similarity with today? Maybe. The slow passage from the British to the American hegemony, that was then, came to an end, this passage, with the second phase of globalization, when the American empire replaces the British Empire, the US dollar replaces the British pound, and the gold standard is replaced by gold exchange standard. Here, the new international economic order is set up, the ITO that will not be created in the end, but now we have the WTO, the IMF, the World Bank, each of them dealing with one specific objective, efficiency, stability, equity, are the 3 objectives that Musgrave had identified for public policy. And this is arranged at the international level. IMF, stability, World Bank, equity, and WTO, efficiency in trades. But this was characterized, as we know, by the absence of capital movements. The fall of Bretton Woods implied that fixed exchange rates were not there anymore. The inconsistent trinity was not applying, therefore, anymore. And then with flexible exchange rates, also free capital mobility could come in. So capital, in the third phase, capital was allowed to move across countries. The third phase was the revolution in political science, in economics, in the political life, with Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan, and the Keynesian economics was abandoned and left the room for neoliberal policies, for keywords like liberalization and privatization and so on. Some aspects accompanied this third phase, raising within countries economic inequalities, both in the north and in the south, although there was a reduction of across countries inequality. Why? Because some of the poorest countries started growing, and so across countries, mainly China, India, growing, implied that this across countries inequality got reduced. So global exports increased, but already some rearrangement of trade, of the role of different parts in the world started taking place. So here we see that, for example, north-north trade started decreasing over time to give more role at the world level to south-south trade. So the role of what now we call BRICS started increasing, and more and more role has been taking place by trade within these countries, within South-South as well. There is also a change, a difference in the composition of the exports coming from developing countries, least developed countries, and as we see at the beginning, developing countries were exporting mostly minerals, fuels, raw materials, and then over time manufacturers became more relevant, as we all know. Migrations, from point of view of labor, we see that there has been an increase, a non-dramatic increase, and I have a section on migrations at the end, if we have time, to show that, you know, there are many things that, many perceptions that are not so correctly drawn. And you see 3.3% on maybe 3.4 at the moment percent of the population living in a country who was not born in that country recently. So capital movements, so I'm touching, you know, trade, labor and capital. And as for capital, we have this fact that, you know, standard economic theory would suggest that capital should flow where is mostly needed, and one would think that where is mostly needed in the south is the south of the world, but in fact this is not the case. Capital flows mostly towards developed countries. You know, there was a Lucas paradox that he pointed out. Basically, capital is attracted where it's more productive, so not necessarily where it is more scarce, right? So it tends to go to California rather than to where it is less available. Different composition of capital flows. We had at the beginning bank lending, very relevant, but then over time FDIs became more relevant, and also some portfolio bonds and shares. The role of over the counter derivatives, which is really significant, you know, 5 times as large as the GDP at the world level, the flow of these derivatives. Now, all these implied some criticisms of what has happened, has implied some criticism. But this criticism, and especially the criticism and the period that we are experiencing today, is not the first period of criticism. In fact, we all remember, well, some of us remember, that there was a first period of criticism already in the 80s, but especially at the end of the 90s, with the, you know, some riots, in fact, in Seattle, in Genoa. So the current period of criticism is not the first one. And there is a clear distinction between what happened before and what is happening now in terms of criticism. So I'm claiming that the first wave of criticism that occurred in the 90s, but also in the 80s, was mostly coming from sort of a left-wing perspective, and mostly coming from southern countries, or from a southern perspective of globalization. So, if we want to summarize the idea of, the difference between the two, we were used to think of multinational companies as damaging developing countries. So those who were criticizing them were saying that these multinational companies were taking over, the developing countries, least developed countries, and all these things. They were, overwhelming and so too powerful, and they were exploiting workers. This left-wing perspective on globalization, on multinational companies. And today we hear Trump saying, well, no, multinational companies are actually damaging the United States. They should not go. They should, reshore. They should come back, because they are taking the jobs of Americans away. So they are giving jobs to other people in other countries rather than giving these jobs to. So, this is, I think, a clear, easy, classification of the different criticism. But especially in the first part, since this criticism was coming from, again, a left-wing, a southern perspective, everything remained the same, business as usual. So this was discarded, this criticism was discarded as coming from irrational people who didn't understand really economics, who were just irrational, and so on. So anyway, I can continue while you... Oh. Okay, so, and the idea was then at the time, there is no alternative. How can you dare to think that you can stop this? This is an unstoppable phenomenon, right? Nothing really changed at the time. Now, and also, the left, this is what we are here. I just read a declaration by Calenda this morning. I woke up rather early. Calenda, this politician of the Democratic Party, or we left, whatever, I don't know. And he said, I used to read Alesina and Giavazzi saying that, we should protect the workers, but not the work, the job, not the job, right? The workers, but not the job. And I used to like this. I used to think, wow, that's a great point. And he said, but now I discovered that I was wrong. The workers had to be protected together with their job, which I still, don't. Oh, see, which is something that I think is very debatable. So what you should be protecting people who were producing typing machines because otherwise they would lose job. I mean, this is a bit debatable, right? But at the time, the point was that even the center-left parties were embracing this idea, right? So it was difficult, and these are some critiques coming from the left. It's difficult to claim that Blair or Schroeder were doing something different from the others, from the Thatcher's paradigm. But anyway, those critiques were supported by Rodrik, Stiglitz. There is no time. I wanted to do also some formalization. There is Giuseppe Bertola here, and I would like to take advantage to show a little bit of what I'm doing on globalization. So I'm going to skip this, and I'm going to, well, of course, it's debatable. What is the situation we are in now at this point? Is it a phase of deglobalization as De Cecco was envisaging already a few years ago, or not? And there are, in fact, signs of this. But in any case, even if we move now to protectionism in these days, as Trump is doing at the moment, would that be very surprising? Would that be something weird in historical terms? Not really. Not really, because this America First idea is an idea that has been going on for a long time in the past. If we were to stick to comparative advantages, America, the United States of America, would be the most important, influential, important agricultural economy in the world, because their comparative advantage was in agriculture. And in fact, the separation with Britain came precisely because the British wanted to impose their manufactures, and America wanted to have some protectionism and to develop their own manufacturing, their own manufacturers. And in fact, there are some nice quotations. Maybe I can read it. For centuries, England had relied, this is Ulysses Grant, President of the United States of America in 1869, 1877. For centuries, England has relied on protection, has carried it to extremes, and has obtained satisfactory results from it. There is no doubt that it is this system that it owes its present strength. So England owes to protectionism its present strengths. Liszt used to say that there was a ladder for development that was protectionism, and these important countries, developed countries like United States, England, had taken this ladder of protectionism, but once they had taken advantage of it, and once they had reached the top, they had taken the ladder away for the others. The others couldn't take the same ladder. So this is saying, after 2 centuries, England has found it convenient to adopt free trade because it thinks that protection can no longer offer it anything, right? So England moved to free trade because it was in its interest. Very well then, gentlemen, my knowledge of our country leads me to believe that within 200 years, when America has gotten out of protection all that it can offer, it too will adopt free trade, right? This is what Ulysses Grant. And then there is another quotation which is quite nice, Abraham Lincoln. Well, I don't know much about economics, he said, but I do know this, if I need a coat and I buy it in America, I have a coat and America has the money, right? Again, protectionism, that was very much in place. So 5 minutes, yes. So I would use these 5 minutes to skip lots of things. Migrations are quite interesting, etc. But I'd like to propose to you something that I'm working at the moment, which is, well, trying to apply to globalization an old, well, relatively old, we are all young, an old literature, which is the literature on target zones that owes to Giuseppe Bertola its development at the beginning. This is a literature that was started by Paul Krugman at the end of the 80s, and then it was, Paul Krugman came up with this idea that if you impose a limit to a given variable and this limit is credible, then the expectations actually provide a stabilizing effect, right? And you benefit of a sort of leeway, what he dubbed honeymoon. So you can actually increase the level of the fundamental variable if you have this credibility effect stabilizing. And then Giuseppe Bertola and Caballero argued and proved that this is a system which is actually only valid if you have a credible target, upper target. Because in the lack of credibility, rather than having a honeymoon, you have a divorce. So you have a separation. You have, in fact, the opposite effect. Expectations play on the other side. So, in fact, and we'll see in a simple graph, if you have this target which is not credible, the more you get close to the target, and the more is likely that this target will be overtaken. So this was the idea applied to exchange rates, to fixed exchange rates. Then recently, there are a couple of papers, Journal of Macroeconomics, Dynamic Macroeconomics, that apply these target zones literature to the euro area crisis, to public debt. And I'm not going to enter into the details there. The target is the possibility for the governments to actually stabilize public debt thanks to primary surplus. There is a limit to the primary surplus that countries can run. There is a feasibility limit. There is a fiscal fatigue. You cannot impose 30%, tariffs or taxes on citizens, or you cannot cut all services. There is a limit, right? So anyway, that was the point. But then I thought that this might also be applied to globalization. Why? Because you have some costs for globalization. CT is the cost. GT is the globalization. So GT is the fundamental, right? But the cost depends on the fundamental, but also on an expectation effect, on a self-fulfilling effect. So the more you expect the cost of globalization to be high, the more the cost actually increases, right? So if we accept this and we take the usual assumption of that is made in the target zones literature, where this fundamental follows a Brownian motion process, and we develop the model, and I'm not going to go into the details. We have some standard, and I'm sure Giuseppe recognizes this very well, standard equation that defines the fact that the linear relationship between the cost and globalization is actually affected by the expectations. So it can be affected positively, as in this case, right? And you see that G bar is the level of globalization that can be reached linearly according to a given cost that the governments are supposed to be accepting. The cost is the limit, the target that governments do not want to overtake. But if this is credibly established, if governments are actually credible in this promise not to let the cost of globalization exceed, then you have this honeymoon effect. Globalization can actually move even farther than what would be acceptable. Smooth spacing is this smooth touching of this nonlinear curve to the target. This is how I think Krugman himself defined this process. Then, here you have the two together. However, you have the Bertola and Caballero effect, the divorce effect. So the other, the convex nonlinear curve is the case in which this target is non-credible. So at the moment in which governments are not credible in their promise to protect the workers, let's say, to protect citizens against the negative effects of globalization. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. Once that happens, then you have that globalization has to finish before, then would eventually finish in the absence of expectations or the expectation effect. Okay? So this is a first blind, simple application of the target zones technology to the globalization point, to the globalization issue, problem. Then another little thing is trying to put together this literature on target zones with the idea of heterogeneous agents. So the idea is, what happens if this target is not known with certainty by people, because people do not observe it with certainty, do not know it with certainty. This target would be what? Would be the result of a loss function of the government that has to minimize a loss function that depends on the costs of globalization and the benefits of globalization, right? So depending on the preferences of the government, on, do you care about inequality within your country or not? If you do care a lot, then it means that globalization is very costly to you. If you prefer to have more growth, then you go for globalization. You get the benefits of globalization. But if people are not certain about this level, then you have a probability distribution of this, what is the actual target. You don't know for sure. And anyway, if you develop the model, what happens is that this target zones model moves in this sort of smooth transition from credibility to lack of credibility, right? So the more globalization proceeds, the more people become aware that actually the government is not holding its promise to keep the costs low. And so they start challenging globalization. They start fearing globalization. And therefore, the expectation effects becomes negative rather than positive. So the stabilizing effect, the fact that the costs are below the linear dotted line, turns into negative effects of the expectations, and the costs exceed the linearity. And I think that's enough. Thank you. Water. Okay.
Thank you for the presentation. We have 10 minutes for discussion. So, are there questions?
I guess in the book you treat that you were talking about globalization always in trade terms, and we all know that the big push towards globalization has been on financial terms, and actually none of that is going back, and actually, if any, is moving, in a more synchronized manner. You see central banks actually operating in a more coordinated way now than they used to do 10 or 20 years ago. And even after the financial crisis, nothing has really changed in that respect. So all these things about the phases of globalization and the political economy behind it, I mean, it looks like it's affecting only one layer of globalization, but not the main one, which has overcome since the 90s on the back of technological change. So what is your view on that?
Yeah, it seems a paradox, because if according to some people, to many people, in fact, the crisis came precisely because of these liberalization capital movements that took place after World War II. That was not there. There was this famous paper, Goodbye Financial Repression, Hello Financial Crisis, right? So it seems paradoxical. Yes, it's true. And it's true also that the signs of the retreat of globalization are in FDIs, are in trade, but yeah, it's true, not necessarily in, although FDIs are part of capital, but not the financial part of the capital movements, yes. But I substantially agree with you, which is sort of, but if you think, it's also paradoxical that the answer to globalization comes from, populist movements. That's also a paradox, to think that people who have been hurt by globalization are now trusting Brexit and Trump, which is a bit weird in my view, at least. So, thank you.
Just two short points. The first one, you skipped the second wave of criticism.
Oh, yeah.
Suppose,
I'm sorry, yeah.
Right wing and north-driven. Which years you start for that? 2010 or
After the global financial crisis. Although, again, Oh, yes, sorry.
No, the second was a question. The last point, your target zone literature-based approach is very interesting. Could you apply to a single country, for example, to China?
I'm not sure. I have to think about that. Well, you have to apply in a country where people have the right to do things, and I'm not sure that China is the kind of country where.
There's a problem.
Yeah. So I don't know that.
The counter example.
Yeah. So anyway, the first point is, the thing I wanted to say is it's also paradoxical. Again, if you think the global financial crisis started in the United States, hit hard the United States, but the United States is the country that has come out of the global financial crisis better than any other country, with the policies that have been taking place, Keynesian policies, the fiscal stimulus, and their unemployment rate is, satisfactory. One can say, yes, are those people employed, in good shape or not? Is their income satisfactory or not? Maybe there are people who work but still under the poverty line. But the paradoxical result is that Trump and populism started growing in a country that actually has been able to respond to globalization better than any other countries. And if you think, again, quite paradoxically, Brexit has come in place in a country that has not been hit by the euro area crisis. Quite often we compare Spain with Britain, with the UK. And we say they had the same public debt to GDP level, but Spain was attacked, was under crisis, and Britain was not, right? Because Britain had the central bank backing, blah, blah. So again, you have the protest against the crisis, against the problems that have come out in those days, has come in Britain. That was paradoxically not hit by the euro area crisis. This is again another paradox. Then for China, I don't know. I have to think about that more carefully. Whether the cost again, there you need to have a market power. I'm not sure that Chinese consumers have this market power. Any Chinese markets have this market power. I don't know. I mean, I have to think more carefully, but it's a tricky and nice question. Thank you.
Other questions or comments? Actually, okay. Please, Vittorio.
One point. One is that when we compare the first phase of globalization and the second phase of globalization, we must take into account that the first phase of globalization was made partly, but substantially, between the center and the periphery of empire, colonial empire. So between countries that were not the periphery of the empire were not put on to the side trade decisions. While the second phase is an independent country, even with a very different political and economic power. And that is important. Otherwise, and the second point is that as regards the United States, the last piece that you said, in the United States, if you look at the electoral results, the decision in favor of Trump against Hillary Clinton was made particularly in two states, Illinois, Michigan, and in the other states. And these states were typically democratic than in the previous election. But there were states where the recession had hit struck more heavily. And many people had lost jobs or had worse jobs than before. And Trump was very able, probably using big data from Cambridge Analytica and so on,
So Calenda was right then. Those were yes, as for the voluntary thing, that's quite important because it's precisely because of this voluntary aspect. Yeah. Trade. You know, one question might be, wasn't you know, I was a tourist guide when I was young, and I used to tour people in Tuscany in the Etruscan areas, and there were these vases, this pottery. And they were the quote-unquote Chinese of the time. Why? Because they were copying, replicating the pottery of the Greeks. And you can actually see in museums these potteries of the Etruscans, the fake, and the potteries of the Greeks, very nice. You know, so you can actually compare them. Yeah. So you had trade at the time, and the question is, wasn't that globalization? Why don't we call it globalization? And the thing is that was not systematic and was not sufficient to determine price convergence, assuming that we could measure price convergence at the time. So it's not, you know, it's not such as, you know, it's not systematic, it's not something, these were occasional things, but not overwhelming on a global scale and limited. Another point is voluntarily, the fact that these relationships had to take place voluntarily. And this is precisely why economists tend to say, well, even when the slaves were taken out of Africa and brought to the United States, that was not globalization. Why? Precisely because that movement was not a voluntary movement of people going to the United States. It is also true that this period was characterized by the Opium War, you know, Britain forcing China, the United States forcing Japan to trade. But in some ways, at a later stage, this voluntary aspect is recognized. So in some ways, at a later stage, this colonial effect has been interpreted as being diminished. But certainly, I mean, if that period was again a period in which trade was not free, was not a deliberate choice, then you would certainly be right to. So what we should probably do is to contest the fact that that period was a period of free choice, of actual free choice. Economists have put together the fact that over time that trade became more deliberate with those states, and the fact that there were signs of price convergence. That's the other thing that characterizes the measurable effect of globalization, the fact that we can mark the date of globalization according to that measure, to that number, to the fact that we could actually measure the price convergence.
Are there other comments or questions? Okay, so thank you so much.
Thank you.
And now there's a coffee break in the same room where we were yesterday.